The men who ran half of Montreal's underground didn't ask Eloise Martel for her opinion. They didn't ask for her name either. She was the woman at the corner desk, the one who kept her cardigan buttoned to the collar, who arrived before anyone else and left after everyone had gone, who never once raised her eyes when Raphael Kane walked through the door. She had learned, early on, that invisible was safe. Eloise had been doing the books for Kane Holdings for 14 months before she understood exactly what kind of holding company it was. She had suspected, of course. You didn't work 26 floors above the Port of Montreal and count the kind of numbers she counted without developing a sense for what those numbers meant. But suspicion and certainty were two different things, and Eloise Martel had always been better at carrying questions than answers. She was 31 years old. She wore her dark hair in a low bun that she'd been doing the same way since university. Her clothes were comfortable and forgettable. She had learned that lesson the hard way back in her first accounting job, when a fitted blazer had earned her a month of commentary she hadn't asked for. Now she wore blouses a size too big and cardigans that swallowed her shoulders, and she sat at her corner desk and she worked, and the men in expensive suits walked past her like she was a lamp. Raphael Kane himself had looked at her exactly twice in 14 months. The first time was the day she was hired, when he'd glanced up from a file folder, taken in whatever he saw, and said to his deputy, "Fine, she starts Monday." The second time, she hadn't known he was looking at all. The night it began was a Thursday in November, and Montreal was doing what Montreal does in November, which is to say, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind off the river had teeth. Eloise had stayed late to reconcile the Q3 reports. The office had emptied out around her, one desk lamp at a time, until only she remained. The overhead fluorescents humming, the window behind her showing a city trying to look important through the dark. She wasn't anxious about being alone in the building. She was used to it. She preferred it in a way she would never have admitted to anyone. She was packing her bag when she heard them. Voices below. Not in the office, but coming from the service corridor that connected the building's private garage to the floor below hers. Low voices, male, the kind of register that didn't carry meaning so much as weight. And then, unmistakably, the sound of someone in pain. Eloise stood very still. She was a practical woman. She knew what the sensible choice was. She had 14 months of carefully cultivated invisibility to protect. She pressed the strap of her bag against her shoulder and walked to the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby. The doors opened on the floor below. She hadn't pressed that button. She was almost certain. She hadn't pressed that button. What she saw, in the fluorescent half-light of the service corridor, stopped her entirely. 8 men in the kind of clothes that meant they'd been working since sunrise, sitting on the bare concrete floor, with their backs against the wall. One of them had his jacket off, and the man beside him was doing something to his arm with a strip of cloth that wasn't doing much good. They were all being very quiet, in the way that people are quiet when they've used up their words. They looked hungry. They looked like men who had not sat down in a very long time. One of them noticed her standing in the open elevator. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with the kind of eyes that have given up expecting anything good to happen next. Eloise Martel looked back at him. Then she looked at the torn jacket, the makeshift bandage, the grey faces, the 8 men who were clearly never supposed to be seen by someone like her. She pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed. She rode down alone. In the lobby, she crossed to the building's small kitchen, a room so narrow it was basically a hallway with a coffee machine, and she stood in front of the open refrigerator and did an inventory. There was half a rotisserie chicken from someone's forgotten lunch. There were 2 cartons of soup stock, nearly full, that someone had left on a shelf with a name written on them in marker that had long since faded. There were eggs. There were the remains of a fruit plate from a morning meeting. There was bread, slightly stale, in a bag on the counter. She was not, technically, a remarkable cook. She had never described herself that way, not once. Her grandmother had been a remarkable cook. Her aunt, Sylvie, who could turn a half-empty pantry into something that made you want to sit down and cry a little, had been a remarkable cook. Eloise had grown up watching them, standing at their elbows, learning not because she was studying, but because it was just what you did. You stood in the kitchen while the women who loved you worked, and eventually it got into your hands. She pulled out the chicken. She found a pot. 25 minutes later, she was standing in the service corridor with a tray that she had assembled from the kitchen's catering supplies. There was a large pot of soup, proper soup, chicken, and whatever root vegetables she'd found in the crisper drawer, seasoned with the spice rack that someone had optimistically installed and then apparently never touched. There were 8 portions of bread, torn rather than sliced, because she'd found no knife. There was strong tea in paper cups, because the French press had been missing its plunger. The man who had looked at her with those grey eyes looked at her again now, and something in his face shifted, and he said, in a voice that was rougher than she'd expected, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Eloise said. She set the tray down and left. She told herself, walking to her car through the November dark, that it was a one-time thing. She had seen men who needed feeding, and she had fed them, and now it was done, and she would go back to being invisible in the morning. She went back the following Thursday. She wasn't sure what made her go. It wasn't calculation. Eloise was very good at calculation, and no calculation would have produced this outcome. It was something else, something quieter. The same instinct that made her notice when the receptionist looked like she'd been crying and leave a coffee on her desk without a note. The same thing that made her learn the names of the overnight security guards. The same thing that had gotten her into trouble more than once for paying attention when it would have been smarter not to. She brought a better soup this time. She'd planned for it, bought ingredients on her way in that morning, smuggled them up in her tote bag. By the time 9 o'clock came and the office emptied out, she had a pot of something that smelled, she felt, like a credible attempt at her grandmother's pea soup. She brought it down on the same tray, and the same grey-eyed man was there, and this time there were 9 of them, and one of them was very young. The young one looked at the soup like he wasn't sure he was allowed. "Go ahead," Eloise said, because she had noticed. She sat with them this time. Not for long. She was not someone who did things like sit on service corridor floors with the men who worked the dark edges of a criminal empire, but she sat, and she ate a cup of soup herself, and she learned their names. Marcel. Thierry. Not the same Thierry as anything, just his Thierry. Dougie, who was from Fredericton and had the vowels to prove it. The young one was named Philip, and he was 19, and he was trying very hard to seem like he wasn't. She did not ask what they did. They did not tell her. By the 4th Thursday, Marcel had started calling her Mademoiselle Eloise, and it had stuck, and the group had grown to 11. By the 6th, someone had left a bag of good Quebec cheese on the corner of her desk, and there was no note, but she understood. She never mentioned any of it to anyone in the office. She simply did her work and kept her accounts straight, and went down to the service corridor on Thursdays, and came back up again, and nobody above the 14th floor seemed to notice. She was almost sure that nobody above the 14th floor knew. She was wrong. Raphael Kane noticed most things. This was not a reputation he cultivated for its own sake. He had no interest in performing perceptiveness, the way some men in his position did, making a show of seeing through people to make them nervous. He noticed things because in his business, not noticing got people killed, and Raphael Kane had been responsible for a great many lives, for a great many years, and he had a particular allergy to carelessness. He noticed, for instance, that his building's kitchen inventory had begun fluctuating on a weekly basis. He noticed that the overnight logs showed a pattern of activity in the service corridor on Thursday evenings. always between 9 and 10:30 p.m. He noticed that the men who worked those corridors, the ones who did the work that couldn't be done in daylight, had been arriving to their Friday morning briefings with a quality he could only describe as steadied, less coiled. The particular loosening of men who have been recently fed, he did not at first connect this to the woman at the corner desk. The woman at the corner desk was, from an operational standpoint, invisible. He knew she was there because the building required her to be there, because someone had to run the accounts, and because his deputy had vouched for her. He knew her name because names were part of what he noticed, Eloise Martel. The reports she produced were flawless. He had checked once in the first month and had not needed to check again. She arrived early and left late and had never, in 14 months, required his attention. That was, genuinely, the highest compliment Raphael Kane paid to anyone in his operation. He began to watch her on the Thursday nights. Not directly. He was not a man who stood in hallways watching accountants. He watched through the building's security feed, which he had always been able to access, and which almost no one in his operation remembered to account for. He watched her pack up her bag, check the time, and then not leave. He watched her go down to the kitchen. He watched her move through a narrow galley with a kind of focused quiet that reminded him, oddly, of watching a craftsman work. Nothing wasted, nothing hurried, everything purposeful. He watched her carry a tray to the service corridor. He watched his men who had worked for him for years, men who had never once, to his knowledge, said anything to any administrative staff beyond a terse nod in the elevator, make room for her on the floor. He watched Dougie pass her a paper cup with 2 hands, the way you pass something to someone you respect. He watched Philip, who was 19, and who Raphael kept meaning to redirect toward something better, eat his soup with his eyes closed for the first second, and he watched Eloise pretend not to notice that she'd noticed. Raphael Kane sat in his office on the 26th floor, watching a 48-centimeter monitor, and he felt something shift in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. He had run this operation for 11 years. He had inherited it at 32 in circumstances that were not clean and had made it into something that was, in its own way, meticulous. He knew everything that happened inside these walls, or had believed he did. He had not known that on Thursday nights, his accountant, the woman he had glanced at once and categorized as furniture, was feeding his people, not because she was asked to, not because there was any advantage in it for her, not for any reason he could identify, except that she had seen men who were hungry and had thought, "I can make something." He called Marchand, his operations head, the next morning. "The accountant," he said. "Martel." Marchand's pause lasted exactly long enough to tell Raphael that Marchand knew exactly what he was about to be asked. "What about her? When is her contract renewal?" Another pause. 6 weeks. Make it permanent," Raphael said. "Full benefits. Adjust the salary to reflect the actual hours she's putting in." He did not explain. He did not offer context. He hung up and went back to his morning. Eloise found out about the contract adjustment from HR in an email that arrived with no explanation. She read it 3 times. She went to Marchand and asked if there had been an error. Marchand looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "No error," he said, "but the salary adjustment reflects your actual contribution to the organization," Marchand said, in the tone of a man reciting something that had been handed to him verbatim. Eloise went back to her desk. She sat down. She smoothed her cardigan. She looked at the number on the email one more time, and then she closed her laptop and spent approximately 10 minutes staring at the middle distance. She did not know what she had done to earn this. She did, on some level, know exactly what she had done. She just couldn't reconcile the 2 facts. That she had been invisible for 14 months. That she had taken specific, deliberate steps to remain invisible, and that someone had nonetheless seen her. On Thursday, she made boeuf bourguignon. She was not sure what had come over her. She had done the prep at home, in her apartment in Rosemont, her small kitchen smelling of red wine and bay leaves, her cat occupying the cutting board in the way that cats do. She had packed it in thermoses, old ones from her camping kit, and carried them in on Friday morning wrapped in a tote bag that clinked faintly when she walked. She had gotten looks from the receptionist. She had not explained. When she brought it down that Thursday night, Marcel went very quiet. Not the quiet of discomfort, the quiet of surprise, the kind that reaches back and finds something old. "This is," he started and stopped. "My grandmother's recipe," Eloise said, because it was, and because it seemed important to say. Dougie, who was from Fredericton and had never to Eloise's knowledge eaten bœuf bourguignon, had 2 portions and then sat for a long moment with his hands around his paper cup, looking at nothing in particular, and said, "My mum used to make a stew kind of like this, on Sundays." Before, he stopped. "Never mind." "What kind of stew?" Eloise asked, and Dougie told her. And Philip, who had until now been a presence rather than a voice, said that his grandmother made a version of something similar but with dumplings. And then Marcel said something in Quebecois French that made 3 of the others laugh, and for 40 minutes, the service corridor on the floor below the accounts department was warmer than it had any right to be. Eloise rode the elevator back up afterward, and she sat at her desk for a moment before leaving, and she thought, "I am in so much trouble." She did not mean it the way it sounded. She had never, not once, lost track of where she was or who she worked for. She was not naive. She had run the numbers on this operation for over a year, and she understood its geography in the way that only someone who touches all the money understands it. She was not under any illusions, but she had made bœuf bourguignon. She had asked Dougie about his mother's stew, and the trouble she meant was the kind that came not from danger but from caring, from having allowed herself, in the most cautious and incremental way, to belong somewhere she had not planned to belong. The company held its annual winter gathering in December. It was not a party, exactly. Raphael Kane did not do parties. It was a dinner, formal and precise, held at a private dining room at a hotel in Old Montreal that the company used for client events. There were tables with linen. There were candles. There were 47 people in attendance, arranged in a hierarchy that anyone who worked there could read instantly. Eloise had been before, both years. Both times she had found her place at a table near the back, eaten quietly, and left as soon as was politely possible. This year, she found her name card at a table near the front. She stood looking at it for a moment. She looked at the names around it. She was seated between Marchand and a man from operations she knew by sight but not by name, and across from her was an empty place, and she had just registered the name on the place card across from her, R. Kane, when someone said, behind her, "You're not going to stand there all night." Raphael Kane had a voice that she had heard precisely 4 times in 14 months, and each time it had hit her somewhere below the sternum, in the particular way that authority does when it doesn't try to. He was standing slightly behind her, jacket on, no tie, looking at the seating arrangement with an expression she couldn't interpret. "I think there may have been an error," Eloise said, which was what she always said when things happened that she didn't understand. "There's no error," Raphael said, which was exactly what Marchand had said about the salary, and she had the sudden, disorienting feeling that this had been coordinated. She sat down. He sat across from her. For the first 20 minutes of the dinner, she focused on her food and on Marchand, who turned out to be unexpectedly good company, and who had, she discovered, a dry commentary on the hotel's wine list that she found genuinely funny. She was laughing at something he'd said when she became aware that Raphael was watching her. Not the way she was used to being watched. The assessing glance, the flicker of attention that passed over and moved on. He was watching her the way she sometimes watched figures when she was trying to understand what they were actually saying, with a particular stillness and a patience that suggested he was prepared to keep doing this. until something resolved itself. It was, she thought, the most unsettling thing that had ever happened to her at a work dinner. "You've been feeding my men," Raphael said. He said it in the conversational tone of someone pointing out the weather. Eloise set down her fork. "Every Thursday," he continued. "For approximately," he paused, "4 months now, based on the kitchen inventory." "I can explain," Eloise said. "I know you can," Raphael said. "I'm not asking for an explanation." She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she still couldn't read, though she was beginning to understand that this was less about the expression and more about the fact that she had never actually tried to read him before. She had been too busy being invisible to look. "Marcel called you Mademoiselle Eloise," Raphael said. "In a briefing 2 weeks ago." He didn't mean to say it out loud. "He was telling me something about the corridor situation, and he said there was the very slight edge of something that might, in a different man, have been amusement. That Mademoiselle Eloise had mentioned the drainage issue. To me, in a briefing, in front of his entire crew." Eloise thought about Marcel, who was 54 years old and had 2 daughters, and who had told her, one Thursday, that he hadn't eaten a home-cooked meal in 4 months. She thought about how carefully she had kept those Thursdays separate from everything else. I didn't ask him to say anything," she said. "I know." Raphael looked at his wineglass. Philip stopped flinching every time someone raised a voice near him. "Did you know that?" Eloise had noticed. She had not said anything, because it wasn't her place to notice or to say. "He started," she said, then stopped. Started again. "He reminded me of a student I used to know." Raphael looked at her. "Someone who thought that because they'd come in sideways, they weren't allowed to take up space," she said. "So she stopped again. There was no good way to finish that sentence. "You made him feel like he was allowed to eat," Raphael said. "Not a question. Something like that." They looked at each other across the white linen and the candles. He said very quietly, "Thank you." It was 2 words. They cost him something. She could see that. Not much, but something. The way a precise man gives up precision to say the true thing. And Eloise Martel, who had been invisible for 14 months and had not minded until exactly this moment, felt the thing she had been holding carefully in her chest come slightly loose. "You don't have to thank me," she said, which was the wrong thing to say, and she knew it. "I know I don't have to," Raphael said. The thing about Renata Kane, Raphael's aunt, who had been the household's self-appointed authority for the better part of a decade, and who had attended the winter dinner, as she attended all Kane-adjacent events, in emerald silk and an expression of benign supremacy, was that she had decided, somewhere around the soup course, that she had things to say. She caught Eloise in the hallway outside the bathrooms near the end of the evening. "You're the bookkeeper," she said. "Accountant," Eloise said, because she was not going to let that one go. Renata Kane looked at her the way a woman of a certain type looks at another woman. Top to bottom, deliberate, assessing. "Raphael seems to have taken an interest," she said. "In your work." "I do good work," Eloise said, which was true, and which she said pleasantly, and which could not be argued with. "My nephew's company," Renata said, "has a certain standard of—" "I know what standard it has," Eloise said. "I've been maintaining it for 14 months. Renata blinked. She had the look of someone who had expected more resistance, who had prepared for a particular kind of scene, and was now finding that the scene wasn't playing out. "I'm sure you're very capable," Renata said, switching tacks. "I am," said Eloise. There was a pause. "The accounts," Renata said, "are quite complex." "They are," Eloise agreed. "I enjoy complex." They looked at each other. Renata Kane was a woman who had won a great many conversational skirmishes by simply being more certain than the other person. Eloise Martel had been the only woman in more than a few rooms, and she had learned, slowly and not always pleasantly, that the way through was not to fight and not to yield, but simply to be unmovable. Like ballast. Like a number that doesn't shift when you want it to, Renata said. I see. She went back to the dining room. Eloise stood in the hallway for a moment. Then she straightened her cardigan, and she went back in too. Raphael was standing when she came back, speaking to Marchand and two other men she recognized. He didn't look up immediately, but as she moved toward her seat, he did look up, and he tracked her across the room in that particular way he had. And he said nothing, but he found the conversation he'd been having again with a slight delay that she did not think was accidental. She sat down. He came back to the table 20 minutes later. My aunt spoke to you, he said. Briefly, Eloise said, and she went back to her dinner. Raphael looked at her with something that might have been the ghost of satisfaction. Good, he said. It was Marcel who told her what had been said in the meeting. He didn't mean to. It slipped. The way things slip when you're not thinking about the audience. When you've started to believe that certain people are simply part of the furniture of your trust. He was telling Dougie something in the corridor the following Thursday, and Eloise was setting up the thermoses, and she heard her own name in the wrong sentence. And she went still. What meeting? She asked. Marcel looked like a man who had stepped into a room and found it much smaller than expected. Mademoiselle. What meeting, Marcel? He told her. There had been a meeting the previous week in which 3 of the senior lieutenants had suggested, not subtly, that the woman from accounts was spending time in the lower corridors, and that this might be a security consideration, and that Raphael ought to take note. There had been a discussion. The discussion had not, by Marcel's account, been long. What did he say? Eloise asked. Marcel's expression did the thing it had been doing since November, the shift that said, You have no idea what you've done to this floor, he said. Marcel told her carefully, that Mademoiselle Martel was to be treated with the same courtesy as any other senior member of the organization, and that anyone who had a problem with that could bring it to him directly. Eloise was very still for a moment. No one, Marcel added, brought it to him directly. She stood there, holding a thermos of soup in a service corridor that smelled of concrete and machine oil, and she thought about Raphael Kane standing in a room full of men who ran criminal operations across 4 provinces, saying, She is senior staff, and I will hear your objections personally. She thought about Philip, who no longer flinched. She thought about Dougie's mother's Sunday stew. She thought about Marcel's daughters, and about Renata Kane's retreating silk back, and about a November evening when she'd been standing in front of a refrigerator, doing an inventory of what was possible. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen, which had been the size of a closet and had smelled like heaven, where she had learned without being taught that there was a particular kind of power in feeding people. Not the kind that announces itself. Not the kind that keeps score, but the kind that simply shows up on a Thursday and asks, Are you hungry? Well, she said, and she set the thermos down and she found the ladle. Soup's getting cold. It was February when Raphael asked her to have coffee. Not in the building, outside, at a counter place near the Marché Atwater that she had never been to before and that he clearly had. He ordered in the same easy French he used for everything, and she ordered in the same careful French she used when she was trying not to make a mistake. And the woman behind the counter said something to her that made her laugh that she wasn't expecting, and Raphael watched it happen with the expression of someone observing a confirmation. They sat at a narrow table near the window. Outside, February was doing its worst. The street was the grey-white of packed snow, and people were moving along it with the particular head-down velocity of Montrealers in winter. Marchand tells me, Raphael said, that the Q4 reconciliation was the cleanest we've had in 6 years. The previous system had some structural problems, Eloise said. I know. I designed it. She looked at him. I know, she said. I didn't want to say. Something happened to his mouth, not quite a smile. You could have said. It didn't seem appropriate. Given what? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Given that I was trying to take up as little space as possible, she said. I'm good at it. Taking up less space. I've been doing it for a long time. It's a useful skill in most situations. He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup. And now? He asked. Eloise looked out at the February street. She thought about the service corridor, and Marcel, and Philip, and the Thursday nights that had become the fixed point of her week. She thought about how strange it was that the place where she felt most like herself was a concrete hallway underground. Now I think, she said, that I've used up my invisibility budget. Raphael looked at her for a long moment. Good, he said. He said it the same way he'd said it at the dinner, about his aunt, but this time it meant something different. This time it meant, I see you. I have been seeing you. I have no interest in you being smaller than you are. Eloise Martel, who had spent a long time making herself easy to overlook, sat in a narrow café in February in Montreal and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't realized had been uncertain until it wasn't. She drank her coffee. The snow outside was doing what snow does. The Q1 structure has the same issue, she said. I can walk you through the fix if you want. Show me, Raphael said, and she did. The men in the service corridor found out the way they found out most things, which was sideways and piecemeal, and over the course of several Thursdays. Marcel noticed first. He had always been the one who noticed, and he didn't say anything, but he started referring to Raphael in her presence as Le Patron, rather than as Cain, which was a subtle shift, the kind that says, we know, and we're glad. Philip, who by March had been moved to a different position at Raphael's personal instruction, something more visible, something with a future, stopped by the corridor on his last Thursday to say goodbye. He stood in the doorway, still too young for the gravity he was trying to carry, and he said, You didn't have to. I know, Eloise said, because that was always the answer. I mean it, he said. Nobody down here, nobody had ever. He stopped, tried again. The soup was really good. Eloise handed him a thermos. For the road, she said. He took it with both hands. Dougie cried a little. Later, after Philip had gone. Not big crying, the quiet kind, turned toward the wall, the kind that happens when something good has been witnessed and the body doesn't know what else to do with it. Nobody mentioned it. Eloise topped up his cup. By spring, the Thursday nights had grown to include 3 people from the building's maintenance staff, and a woman named Celeste from the 3rd-floor leasing office who had started stopping in entirely by accident and had kept coming back. It had stopped being a secret some time ago. Eloise had never intended it to be a secret. Exactly. She had intended to be invisible, which is a different thing, and had failed at it so thoroughly and so quietly that by the time she noticed, she had somehow become the fixed point of a Thursday evening that 17 people organized their week around. She had not sought this out. She did not know, entirely, what to do with it. What she did with it was, she showed up. She figured out what people liked. She learned that Marcel could not eat anything with too much pepper because of something that had happened to his stomach in his 40s. She learned that Dougie's favorite thing was anything with potato. She learned that Celeste, who was Haitian and politely skeptical of what she called la cuisine d'Ici, would eat 3 portions of anything if it was warm enough and had enough garlic. She showed up and she paid attention, and she fed people, and she went home on Thursday nights with empty thermoses and felt like a person who had done something real. Raphael, for his part, never came to the corridor. He understood, without being told, that it wasn't his. He had his own way of being present. The salary that now reflected what she actually did. The meeting where he had said her name in front of men who would have dismissed her. The February afternoon in a counter cafe, where he had said good and meant stay. He sent once at Christmas a very good bottle of wine left on her desk with no note. She left, in return, a thermos of his grandmother's lentil soup. She had found the recipe by asking Marcel, who had asked around, who had reported back that apparently Raphael's grandmother had been known for it, and that nobody had tasted it since she died. On the corner of his desk, one Thursday evening, when she knew he would still be working. She did not leave a note either. He called her an hour later from the 26th floor. "Where did you get this?" he said. "I have my sources," she said. A pause. She could hear him eating, or she thought she could. She could hear the sound of a man sitting alone in an office at 10 o'clock at night, having something warm. "It's not exactly right," he said. "No," she agreed. "I didn't have the recipe," I guessed. Another pause. "It's close," he said. "I'll keep working on it," she said. He hung up. She sat at her desk for a moment, in the quiet of the building at night, the city lights pushing dimly through the window behind her. She thought, "I was trying to be furniture." She thought, "I was so bad at it." She gathered her things and turned off her lamp and rode the elevator down to the lobby and out into the Montreal night, where the air had the particular clarity of early spring. Cold still, but a different kind of cold. The kind that has stopped trying to drive you away and is just being honest about what it is. She walked to her car. She was already thinking about what to make next Thursday.